with you previously, Budget Fiscal 2022. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm DK Ross. Now we are joined by policy and research strategist, Dr. Genevieve Philip Durham. We have economist Dr. Ronald Ramkisoon. And last but not least, with us on set, we have a former MP, Minister of Agriculture and Trade, Vasant Bharat. And I'm not sure if it's the last thing, but definitely part of the roadmap to recovery. So we'll see how we can take some of those things and put it into the conversation. But we are very happy to have you three. And I think I want to start with you, please, Dr. Ramkisoon, in terms of your expectations for the budget, fiscal 2022, and the presentation as delivered by the finance minister. Where are we on that scale? Dr. Ramkisoon? All right, I think I'll ask you the same thing, please, Dr. Philip Durham.
Well, sorry?
Oh, yes. So go ahead, please.
Yes, I think the minister has addressed some of the issues that I thought needed to be addressed, and in fact, issues that were raised before. The price of food items, for example, and a couple of the projects that would lead to some kind of recovery going forward. However, I think that he has made very strong assumptions in certain areas, and to that extent, we see a number of projects that had been on the agenda since the last budget remaining there. Not totally surprised by that, but what we have gone through since March last year and this year, as it continues, that is the COVID-19 pandemic, has had tremendous effect and impacts on the economy and on the society. And I don't know to what extent that was adequately taken into account, or at least reflected in the budget, so that when we look at 2022 from the minister's perspective, it appears as if 2020-21 was indeed a blip, and that we will continue once we get over the present situation. And I don't think that we have gotten over the present situation as yet, but I guess
And I'm wondering if one of those assumptions that you were speaking to, Dr. Ramkisoon, was the fact that more people are going to get...
I guess, the present time. And that would be my assessment for the present.
All right. So I'm wondering if one of those things that you're possibly considering as an assumption is that so much more people are going to be willing to receive the vaccine. But we'll get into that conversation in just a bit. One of the things we want is to get an idea of things that took place with agriculture. So there is a small clip that we are going to play. Then we go to you, please, Mr. Bharat, and we'll also see if your perceptions resonate with what was shared by Dr. Ramkisoon. So we do that now. And with that in mind, let me bring you into the conversation, please, Mr. Bharat. So what we've heard from Dr. Ramkisoon so far, does that resonate with you one way or the other? Well, how does it resonate with you?
Thank you, D.K. First of all, I think we need to put this budget in context of previous budgets. The minister has always been long on promises and very short on implementation. So many people say this is the minister's 7th budget, but I don't think it was lucky 7 for the population, because there was a regurgitation of a number of projects and promises that have been made since 2016, in fact, that have continued to come forward. Now, the minister laid a lot of the failures at the door of COVID. But we've got to understand that a lot of the failures in the economy predated COVID. We've had, for example, zero or negative growth since 2016. We've had no new forms of revenue since 2016. In fact, I think earlier this year, UNCTAD, which is the United Nations Council for Trade and Development, issued their report stating that even Haiti received more foreign direct investment than Trinidad and Tobago in 2020, and I think ours registered at negative $489 million US dollars, reflecting essentially an outflow of capital rather than an inflow of capital. Since 2016, we've actually seen ballooning debt to GDP, crossing now I think about 85% of 85% of debt to GDP. Since 2016, we've seen a reduction in our foreign exchange reserves. We started off at about 11 billion in 2011, and I think the minister was boasting that we've just crossed 7 billion. But the reality is, if you deduct the 644 million that just came in from the IMF, as far as the SDRs are concerned, if you deduct the 2.1 billion that has come out of the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, and if you deduct the $2.5 billion of foreign debt that sits in the reserves, you're down to less than 2 billion essentially that would have remained in our foreign exchange reserves. So what we are witnessing today has been exacerbated by COVID, and therefore what it reflects really is a failure of government economic policies over the last 6 years, which essentially was tax the population, borrow more money, take money out of the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, and the sale of state assets. And if you reflect on what the minister is proposing in this budget with property tax, which is taxing the population, he's talked about sale of state assets. No doubt he's going to go into the Heritage and Stabilization Fund again, because he's going to have to fund another budget deficit of over $9 billion. So long on promises. It was a very long statement, I think, lasting 3 hours and 38 minutes. I'm not sure if he's attempting to outstand whoever is going to respond to the budget on the opposition side, but it was very long. And a lot of the promises, as I said, are brought forward from previous years, and a lot will depend on the levels of implementation of these budget proposals.
Thank you so much, Mr. Barrett. And you spoke about strategy, you spoke about policy, and I'm very happy that on the panel this evening we have Dr. Genevieve Philip Durham. How do these things, how did the budget presentation resonate with you, ma'am?
Thank you for having me, DK, and good evening to our viewers and the panelists. Just to tag along on what Dr. Ramkisoon and Mr. Barrett would have indicated, I saw a lot of repetition of the rhetoric from last year's budget in terms of especially the no one will be left behind. And I was heartened to hear that no one will be left behind, but the only problem is that we heard that last year, and I am not sure that we've seen sufficient burden sharing in terms of the load and the fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic. On the bright side, I think it was great to see, as of November the 1st, as Dr. Ramkisoon would have indicated, we have the VAT exemption for the basic food items, because whether or not you would have lost income, I think that, grocery items, market items, it has been a challenge trying to keep up with the vast increases in prices. I was also concerned, and I'm happy that we have Mr. Barrett on the line, because last year we would have gone into the budget talking about the roadmap to recovery, and I'm not sure how many of us are aware of the status of that roadmap. We're also talking about resilience, and resilience for our viewing audience, we're linking that to the ability to bounce back and to recover from shocks, which of course, as was mentioned, has been exacerbated by the pandemic. And I am not sure whether that objective can be met, and if an sufficiently enabling environment has been created for persons to bounce back. I heard some measures. I wasn't quite clear on what was the provisions made for entrepreneurs, but I saw that digitization is again back on the agenda without any indication of the status of things. Like, I'm ready for my e-identity. I am tired of having to go to a government office and having to produce 5 copies of documents that should be streamlined throughout ministries. So I would have really liked to hear some updates in terms of the allocation for that digitalization and digitization thrust. But I was similarly heartened to hear about the settling of outstanding wage negotiations, because I do believe that, as I mentioned, we do have to share the burden, and people's purchasing power has been reduced against the backdrop of global shocks. And I really would also like to hear more information on the National Statistical Institute, which was brought in as a pretext for last year's budget. We haven't heard any update on that. However, we've seen how well the Ministry of Health has been doing in data collection and data dissemination, and I think that we can use that as a perfect model to gathering and sharing data, so that, and also, just while I'm on that note, education, I would have liked to see, I am not sure what the allocation is for research and whether that fits into the allocation for education. So that's my preliminary thoughts, TK. Thank you.
And thank you as much. I see some people nodding when you're sharing your perspective. But just before we go to some of the points that you would have raised, I want to follow up and ask, what are some of the ways that that burden could have been shared a little better, to your view?
In terms of the taxes, tax returns are still outstanding. In terms of the VAT refunds, that is still outstanding. We would have heard promises last year to relieve some of that burden. We are seeing the introduction of new taxes, whether it begins in 2022 or whether it begins immediately. I think that we could put a pause on any and every tax, because it's not an expenditure. Of course, it's a cost to the state, but the introduction of new taxes, and of course I support the government's attempts at making provisions for low-income families, but I do believe that working class and middle class citizens have been similarly affected by the pandemic, and I think that they can use a break as well.
All right, and some of those roadmap recommendations, what are some of those that you would have seen in the presentation, if any, Mr. Barra?
Well, the minister spoke of a further injection to agriculture of $300 million. That seems to have been reduced from the $500 million that was allocated last year. But other than that, I didn't see too many. He spoke about infrastructural projects, which of course were construction, shovel-ready projects that came up at the Roadmap Committee sessions. But again, they are projects that have been on the drawing board for many, many years. The highway to Point Fortin, the port in Turku, the Valencia road to Turku, the highway to Sangre Grande. All of these, they continue to come up budget after budget, but very little seems to be done with regard to the implementation. I'm particularly disappointed with what was said with regard to agriculture, because I think that is what I would call one of the low-hanging fruits, and it's one of the sectors that has undoubtedly been neglected for many, many years. Some of the things that we talked about at the Roadmap Committee with regard to agriculture was guaranteed pricing, for example, for a basket of items, so that the farmers knew at the beginning of the planting season, and possibly for maybe 3 seasons or so in the first instance, that this basket of commodity items, they would be able to get a ceiling price or for it, so in other words, or guaranteed price for it, so that they would not have to worry about gluts in the marketplace. We talked about some form of mandate by government that state institutions should only use locally grown produce. So, for example, the school feeding program, the prison service, the army, state institutions predominantly should be mandated to utilize only locally grown products. We talked about the infusion of technology so that we could excite young people to want to get involved, and that agriculture would actually be looked at and perceived as a real business opportunity for entrepreneurs to get involved. And I made the comment the other day on when we spoke during the week, DK, that I'd visited Costa Rica, and their yields on the same parcel of agricultural land can sometimes be 10 times what our yields are here in Trinidad and Tobago. So it is not that they are cleverer than us. It is not that they know what to do better than we do. The reality is these things have to be implemented. So it's all well and good having these put down as recommendations. It's all very well even reading them in a budget speech. Ultimately, they need to be translated into actionable items. And most importantly, and one of the things that we don't do in Trinidad, is we don't measure our progress with regard to our budget promises. We don't say, look, we promised this last year and this is how far we've reached. So the population knows exactly where we are in that process and can measure our performance as government. So we tend to just pass it off and mention it again or not bring it up again next time in the hope that people won't remember it. For example, the port at Liberia. What has happened to the port in Liberia that the government has spoken about for the last 4 budgets? It was completely left out. So these are some of the issues that we need to address going forward. I thought that the minister had a golden opportunity, like other ministers of finance across the globe, to really press the reset button, to draw a line in the sand and say, listen, this is a vision statement for Trinidad and Tobago. It's not going to be 1,000 things that we're going to put down. These are the 10 or 12 things that we're going to concentrate on to really kickstart the economy. How are we going to create new jobs? How are we going to put money in people's pockets? What's the new healthcare environment going to look like? What are we doing with regard to manufacturing, apart from a few incentives? Because our manufacturers are going to be the engine of growth, and we need to be in a position to really create explosive growth if we are going to create economic activity, and otherwise we're going to just be left behind.
Looking at that growth, I want to get back to agriculture as a point or a premise, a jump-off point, but we do that in just a bit. I want to bring Dr. Ramkisoon back into the conversation. So Dr. Philip Durham would have spoken about different ways that we can tax, and Mr. Barrett just spoke about implementation and how we go about doing that. Looking at taxes, Dr. Ramkisoon, is it a matter of being more efficient with what is on the books already, or looking at what's on the books and seeing whether or not it fits the need, whether or not it's fit for purpose? How do we look at taxes in this regard?
Well, I think for quite some time, various administrations have recognized that we have not been collecting all the taxes that we are supposed to collect. One has to be careful in terms of increasing tax rates because you can reach a point where they become a disincentive to work or a disincentive to invest. So you want to be very careful about doing that. And when you recognize that billions of dollars have been left uncollected over the years, and the government has repeated that over and over, then what you want to do is, before you can consider increasing taxes, you want to make sure that you collect all that is due to you. And I think that is very important. This is where the TTRNA comes in, and one would hope that it is much more successful in doing that than the BIR has been. I want to say, though, DK, on the implementation issue, that while the minister has mentioned some useful incentives or projects in respect of tourism, for example, and the hotels and the new hotels and so on, or in respect of even the older projects like the roads and so on, and then the projects in respect of the transformation of this economy to a digital one, we have always lamented year after year about implementation. And if I recall, the various subcommittee reports and the report itself was very strong about a mechanism for implementation, with the various stages at which various committees would meet, would work, would report, and then you would have had the monitoring and evaluation. If there was one thing I was hoping that would have made this year's budget different from previous years, was some kind of emphasis as to, well, who is responsible for implementing? If it is done, who would be rewarded? If it is not done, who is going to be asked why not? And are there going to be consequences? Because as a country, we have suffered from that kind of not doing those kinds of things. Clear implementation guidelines policy, clear monitoring and evaluation, and penalties or rewards for performance. And I think that especially in the public service, but in other areas, the minister did mention he is prepared next year to get into negotiations for another agreement and so on. But I think we have to address the machinery for getting things done. Otherwise, some of the positive projects that have been mentioned in the budget will just be that. It will just be what we did last year, the year before. And I think that I come back to the point, I wonder if there's sufficient recognition that the world has changed, and we have to be conscious of those changes and be prepared and call upon the population to make the kinds of changes now. If we view what has happened, as some are saying, is indeed an opportunity to restructure, to retool, to rebuild or build this economy.
And I like the fact, I appreciate the fact that you're talking about calling upon the community or calling upon the population. But what levels of access are there for the communication? I bring the example forward of you, Mr. Barrett, saying that there were things that you were hearing from farmers when you had a meeting with them that you weren't sure were making it to the tables of persons who were policymakers. So how do we get that level of engagement across? And because this also has me, yes, I'm cautiously optimistic because hope is the last thing to go. But in terms of the statistic institute that was mentioned, where do you get that information from so that you can make best practice decisions with something that is with well-informed context and history so that you can move forward in a manner that is full of practice going forward?
Well, it comes back to this issue of communication. It also comes back to building trust with the stakeholders and the constituents to whom you are supposed to be serving. So you mentioned agriculture and how did we get the agricultural community to buy into the ministry's programs from 2010 onwards. And it was simple. We engaged 86 farmers groups from across the country over a 2-day session at which I was present for the entire thing. So first of all, I showed that I was willing to be there sitting with them going through the exercise, and it wasn't just left for them and public servants to do it, but I was actually leading from the front. Now, obviously, after years of neglect, a group of people like the farmers of this community, of this country, will view everything with a degree of skepticism. So it takes time to build that trust. But over a period of time, if they see that you are with them all the time, if they see that you're willing to come out to their farms and experience what they're experiencing, if they see that you're bringing your public servants from PS down to Chief Technical Officer, to all of your ministry people, to actually engage with them on their farms, and you're not asking them to come to the ministry in St. Clair, but you're actually going there and you're seeing what they're doing. If you do what, for example, I unfortunately and regrettably for the former government of which I was a part, I actually marched with farmers of this country to show my solidarity that I was interested in their welfare, and what I was telling them for the previous year or so was not just old talk and rhetoric, but I was prepared to put my job on the line because I had gotten a level of trust from them, and they believed in what we were doing, and I think that's important. And I think that once people recognize and see that you are really and truly in it with them, and you are part of the struggle that they see on a daily basis, and it's not just talking down to them, I think they will easily buy into it, because you've gained a level of trust that they believe that you are actually there to help them. And I think that is part and parcel of our problem. We deliver a budget, and we leave it to the public servants to implement. I don't think there's any secret that we need significant public sector and public service reform if we are going to deliver even 1/10 of what a budget speech lays out. So these are all part and parcel, and that's why I say I believe that the minister had a golden opportunity today to map out a vision for Trinidad and Tobago of how Trinidad and Tobago ought to be looking in the next 10 years, and not just for 1 year, because you see, we budget in 1 year cycles. It's an accounting exercise that essentially after this year, everything falls by the wayside and we start again. This budget document needed to be a holistic visionary statement, laying out, for example, public sector reform, what the new education for our children and for teachers is going to look like, what food security is going to look like, what our criminal justice system is going to look like, post-COVID, what our institutions are going to look like, because there's been an erosion of trust in our institutions of state. So I think we missed a golden opportunity here, and I'm sorry to say that I believe that next year, this same time, we'll be talking about a number of the same issues.
And I want to get into that golden opportunity, diving specifically into education after this question, because Dr. Philip Durham, one of the things you spoke about is looking at having to download different things to go into a government office. Sometimes when we speak about part and parcel, we have a little oversight on some parts. So you may be able to fill out a form digitally, but then you need to download it and carry it into an office. So looking at an integrated kind of system, what are some of those things that you want to see put together so that they dovetail holistically and allow us to move a little smoother? Because it's one thing to say, okay, well, we have a good idea, but many times the road to hell is paved with good intentions. So in terms of saying, these are the things that we're going to be working on from different aspects, different silos, breaking them down to work together. What are some of those things that you are looking for, Dr. Philip Durham?
I think it goes back to the implementation deficit that would have been alluded to. It goes back to the communication deficit that would have been alluded to. Because I think somewhere along the lines, I saw many people have benefited from the e-governance system or something along those lines. And to just throw up superlatives to say many people, much of this, many of that, that really is not going to cut it. And we know if we just go to the CSO website right this minute, we don't have information and data in real time. So we are just relying on what is presented in terms of those superlatives, as I say. And then, well, Hale and Francis's Calypso comes to mind. They don't feel like we. Because when you go into these public spaces, because you still have to go in, I cannot at this point, many of the processes completed from A to Z online. So by coming to say that many people have benefited from E this or E that, I think that is a misrepresentation, and we really have to get in the habit of collecting data, doing the research, understanding what the experience is for persons who are going for public goods or services. And that is the only way we will know the improvements that are required. In addition, we need to rewind a little bit and come back to how we communicate things to people, because every year we have the repetition, we have some things that are outstanding, some things that have not been implemented. It would be good for that information to be communicated to the public at large to say, this is the status of the Ministry of Digitization, or this is the status of this project, the National Statistical Institute. We need to have that communication gap brought down a little bit. and we need to confront the reality. It cannot be that, okay, this one person said that, so this is their experience. This has been the overwhelming experience for many persons. If you are doing research just by surveying social media, you will see the responses of the public at large. So we really need to acknowledge where the deficits are, where the shortcomings are, and work with persons who are willing to help in addressing them. And civil society sometimes may not understand the important role that they can play. And simply by sensitizing others of your experience, I think persons who are at the decision-making table will understand that this is a collective experience. This is not an isolated situation or isolated incident. So I think we need to get past the habit of making promises that by the next year we override those promises that were made the previous year, and we're still back to square one without the proper communication and without, of course, the implementation and the efficiency that we are alluding to. And I am not saying this to bash any particular ministry or public service, but we need to be cautious with the words and the superlatives that we are throwing around, and ensure that instead we take the advice and the constructive criticism that is being shared in order to improve the service delivery. And that comes along with this digitalization and digitization thrust that I am still very much, I don't want to say I'm looking at the glass half full, but I am remaining optimistic that it can be realized, because we do have some processes that work fine, but I do not want to have to complete half online and then the other half I have to go and I have to print it myself and be told that the policy has updated and the website hasn't matched what has been updated. And you know, that has to be remedied. It absolutely has to be remedied. So I do hope that for the year, we would see some improvements on the implementation side, and we would see some realistic executions, as well as we need to have realistic timelines for some of these initiatives that are being proposed.
All right, and we have about 1.5 minutes more before we go to the break. Dr. Ramkisoon, you spoke about holding people accountable. Does someone need to implement a punitive measure or using the carrot or the stick when the system just works properly?
Sorry, I didn't hear you clearly. Could you repeat the question?
Do we need to offer incentives, or do we need to be punitive about not following a system if the system just works properly?
Certainly not. I mean, if the system works properly, but remember, individuals are part of the system. And people would like to know that if they achieve whatever the goal is, that they are appropriately rewarded. Is unfortunately in the public service, as far as we know, whether or not you complete the job, did it excellent, or did it halfway, that the compensation is more or less the same. And I think that is a big disincentive to performance. But I wanted, DK, if you allow me to make mention of that point on communication that Geneva and, in fact, Vasant have raised. And there is communication between those who are going to be affected by a particular measure, and that is critical in respect of what you want to introduce or change. However, I think in getting things done in ministries, there must be a whole of government approach. And I think agriculture might be classic, because I think we have had a hardworking Minister Bharat, if I recall, and then I think the current Minister of Agriculture. But I think that there is need for the communication to be across ministries in respect of what the goal is, because very often you will find a particular minister may be trying to achieve a particular goal, but he does not have the full cooperation, awareness, etc. of other ministries. And I think agriculture is a case in point, because it is easy to see the importance of things like access roads or trade measures and that kind of thing in respect of getting agriculture going as a very, very important point.
All right, and this is something that we want to continue, because when people say agriculture, what comes to mind? And in terms of building the conversation out to say, okay, well, these are different aspects of agriculture that need to be attended to. That is something we get into just a bit, but we have a response from political leader of the PNM Tobago Council, Tracy Davidson Celestine. She is responding to the budget presentation, so we go to that now.
I can't say that I'm surprised at anything that was presented in light of the opposition's denial of Tobago's autonomy. An opportunity was lost to do more for Tobago with the additional funding that would have come in this budget. As a result, I am sure that all of Tobago must admit that they feel rather frustrated. A lot of things are standing in our way at this moment. There is the pandemic, the economic contraction, the continued COVID restrictions, and the political deadlock in the Tobago House of Assembly. If only the PDP and the UNC had treated properly with the autonomy bill, that would have guaranteed a 6.8%, an extra $1 billion to Tobago out of every national budget henceforth. But they did what they did. We have to now become more innovative and fall back even more on our own island's resources. But the most important resource here is, of course, the people of Tobago. We don't have the autonomy bill, but Tobagonians have long been autonomous in spirit. It's time to be reminded. The autonomy bill is important, yes, but no legislation is ever effective unless it matches the mores and the beliefs of the people. So, my people, fellow Tobagonians, we must begin striving for autonomy in spirit, even as we work to institute our island's autonomy in law. That's why we have to focus first and foremost on reopening Tobago again. Just as no man is an island, no island can exist in isolation. Our prosperity depends on openness, it depends on visitors, it depends on every Tobagonian being able to pursue their economic goal. That is why it is so important for all adult Tobagonians to get vaccinated so that we can open our shores and our stores once again. There is no other path.
And there we have it from the political leader of the PNM Tobago Council, Tracy Davidson Celestine. And I want to give each of the panelists the opportunity to respond to those comments from Mrs. Davidson Celestine. So we start with you, please, Mr. Barrett.
Well, I'm not quite sure what Mrs. Davidson Celestine means by the fact that Tobago would have been allocated 6.8%. If they had been made autonomous, or if the autonomy bill had been passed in the Parliament. Because, yes, the requirement spans from, I think, just over 4% to 6.8%, but there's no necessity in law, or certainly there would not have been if autonomy had been granted. So I'm not quite sure how that number is relevant. Now, I will say that I have a soft spot for Tobago. I must admit. I have a home in Tobago, and I've had a home in Tobago for many, many years. And I love the people of Tobago. I think that Tobago has huge development potential. I think it's been mishandled by successive governments. I think that possibly a lot of what is being thrown Tobago's way at the moment is possibly in light of the fact that there is an upcoming election imminent. But I think we need to really look at Tobago as a real gem in the Caribbean and understand how we can differentiate Tobago from St. Lucia or Grenada or Barbados or Jamaica. What is it that we can offer in Tobago that those other countries are not offering, or what is it that we can do better in Tobago that the other countries are currently doing? And I think that really does require a proper analysis and proper engagement, and not just some slapdash policies that are thrown into a budget mix in the hope that it'll excite people. I think a lot more needs to be done, and this is why I mentioned earlier on. We need to be selective as a country, Trinidad and Tobago, about the areas that we are serious about where we can have competitive value to the world and to ourselves, and concentrate on those things, and send people to school, for example, at university, so that when they come out, a cadre of people, they have the skill sets to fill those jobs. I think that's what we're missing here. We are being everything to everybody, as opposed to really doing the hard work of understanding what is it that we can be good at, what is it that we can offer to the world to get these new forms of revenue, what is it that we can offer to the world that will create a better standard of living because of kinds of jobs we'll create for our own people here in Trinidad and Tobago. And I think that's the point that we're missing.
Building capacity and forming cadres that can actually exploit opportunities. Thank you very much, Mr. Barrett. And I want to go over to you, please, Dr. Ramkisoon, to ask you your thoughts.
What always comes to mind, and it came to mind again there by the reaction by Ms. Davidson, really is the potential that Tobago has. The minister mentioned quite a number of new hotels and some not so new projects in respect of what he plans for Tobago. Tobago has been operating way below its potential as a country for many, many years. And we just have to look across the region and see what other islands have done and have been doing with their tourism plant. In Trinidad and Tobago has not really done the kind of work in building out the possibilities for Tobago, in making it that green island that we all love, really. Mr. Barrett indicated he has particular interest there. My interest, of course, is in enjoying Tobago as often as I can. And I think for us to see the potential, then we have to look seriously at the projects in respect of developing tourism, and however developing it in a way that is sustainable. At this time, we cannot do the old tourism. We cannot neglect to pay attention to the environment. It must be the kind of tourism that takes on board the preservation of the flora and fauna of Tobago, and of maintaining it in a way in which Trinidadians, Tobagonians, and the world would enjoy it as they do in other parts of the Caribbean. So those kinds of reflections I have on what was just said.
And that reminds me of the conversations of growth versus development. But let me ask you for your reaction, please, Dr. Philip Durham.
DK, I think I want to revert to the point of that tourism product. The reality is that we have Aruba, Bonaire, Curacao, some neighbors that are much closer than Jamaica, and the others that were mentioned. They are extremely safe havens that have a competitive advantage with their tourism products. They are over-reliant on tourism, of course, but they are very well known for the tourism product that they offer, and I do not think that Tobago can be competitive in spite of its rich culture and heritage. I do think, however, that Barbados, we may recall that Barbados would have leveraged the idea of digital nomads, and I think that may be a good avenue. We really have to focus on what we are good at, and I would have mentioned this in another forum recently. One thing that we take for granted, we have an exceptional telecommunications infrastructure, and we are excellent when it comes to generating electricity. We have frequent power outages throughout the Caribbean. In Trinidad and Tobago, we do have that advantage in terms of being able to attract digital nomads, and I think that is a good avenue that Tobago can explore, because I feel the reality is there is no competition when it comes to the much safer ABC Islands. And Tobago is very safe, but in comparison to, we have to remember we are part of, it's Trinidad and Tobago. So tourists will examine this context being part of Trinidad and Tobago, and for the most part, you have to transit through Trinidad to get to Tobago. But I do think that the digital nomad concept can be leveraged rather than the sun, sea, and sand that we may be looking toward. Frankly, it's too late. It is really too late to try to get on board with the tourism by overpopulating the island with hotels and so on. I do not think that is necessarily the next best step for Tobago. Tobago can very well, I agree that it's okay for them to have the hotels and so on, but they may remain empty if we are looking toward competing with the tourism products that our neighboring islands have.
But in terms of leveraging that tourism product, Dr. Philip Durham, is it a matter of saying, okay, well, yes, there's sun, sea, and sand, but others have us beat on that? But looking at the fact that there was a recent designation of man in the biosphere, looking at the fact that Tobago has one of the oldest rainforests in the Western Hemisphere, and shifting what it is we focus on as the product coming out of Tobago, along with the digital nomads.
That, of course, certainly, but we also have to remember that we have Dominica that has had the lead as the native island in the region. We have Costa Rica in the hemisphere as well that has that very green tourism agenda. And we need to be careful that we are not venturing into products and services that we have available on the islands that have an established tourism product that is very distinctive. And I think the rainforests, of course, the main ridge and so on, these are, and as I said, Tobago does have a distinctive culture, a distinctive heritage, but we need to temper our ambitions with the reality that is around us. And it is safe. You have connectivity 24/7. We have an exceptional infrastructure. And I think we need to start with the telecommunications and electricity infrastructure that we have, and then we can build from there around the other attractions that we have. Because if you're coming to work, you want consistent power supply, you want consistent internet supply, and that is one thing I think Tobago can provide exceptionally well compared to any of our closest regional neighbors who would have other things that Tobago has.
All right, I know that Dr. Ramkisoon, we had him for a shorter period of time than the other panelists. So with regard to that, there is, I spoke to the agricultural feature. We play that, and then we get into discussing that feature when we return.
Minister Com Imbert said the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries has designed a series of agriculture projects and programs to access the stimulus package, and said several of these projects are ready to commence.
The funding is intended to support the securing of adequate quality seeds, the use of an alternative feedstock, and the regularization of land issues to accelerate land tenure and access to idle state lands. This fund is in addition to the normal budgetary allocation.
Among the projects is an access road repair program which will commence in 2022 and will cover 80 kilometers and provide relief for over 400 farmers at a cost of $75 million.
The areas include Matlot, Toko, Manzanilla, Sangagandi, Talparo, Wallerfield, Maracas, St. Joseph, Tunapuna, Orange Grove, Braco Seco, Paria, Blanchisez, Lopino and Paramin.
He said the Minister of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries will elaborate on further measures for the sector during the debate.
And with that, I want to ask your thoughts, please, Mr. Barath, but also in the context of asking what are some of the things that we are missing when we think about agriculture? Because sometimes people, I think you just have the idea of someone in the field, working in the sun, as opposed to the person who is able to deal with plumbing to set up a hydroponic or aquaponic system, or somebody who is able to do so many other things, and these being part and parcel of agriculture as well. Your thoughts, though, please.
I don't think the general population understands, or anybody who operates outside of the sphere of agriculture understands how hard it is to get involved in agriculture in Trinidad and Tobago and to be able to sustain it. First of all, the imagery of a farmer is that this is something he's gotten into because he has no academic qualifications, and it's the bottom of the ladder, and he has nothing. He can't do anything else, and therefore he goes and plants the land. So first of all, the whole imagery of what a farmer is and what a farmer does needs to change. But the reality is the farming community, the agricultural sector, faces today the very same problems they faced for the last 50 years. Water, either too much water or too little water. So either flooding or drought. Infrastructural issues. The minister is talking about putting in 75 kilometers of access roads. Well, that's a drop in the bucket. During the 2010-2011 period, the ministry actually put down 250 kilometers of access roads, and that was just the start of it. We actually put down 300 retention ponds across Trinidad and Tobago in that 1 year period. So infrastructure costs, financing costs. The ADB has lost its moorings in terms of being able to assist farmers. The cost of inputs. Most of the inputs, including fertilizers, are imported, and so therefore it increases the cost based on the cost of inputs coming in to the country. Gluts in the market we spoke about earlier on. Farmers have to deal with situations where if the price of tomatoes is $18 a pound today, and others get involved, by the time the crop is ready to be reaped, it's $5 a pound. So they operate in peaks and troughs, and that's why I was talking about having guaranteed pricing for farmers for a certain cadre or a certain basket of food items. Predial larceny is still a major problem for farmers in this country, and we've seen it highlighted on a regular basis, where farmers are threatened, not just their produce and their animals, but they have themselves threatened by people who come in generally from outside of their areas and steal their crops. And the whole issue of security of tenure. There are farmers in this country who cannot access any of the incentives that the ministry offer today because their leases have expired, and some of those leases have expired for 15, 20 years now. And as a direct result, that $300 million that's been promised by the minister, none of those farmers whose leases have expired can access those incentives. And this is the reason why in 2010 I had waived that requirement and said, listen, once you've had a lease previously and it has not been renewed through no fault of your own, you can access all of the government incentives. So, we have to understand that these are, it's very good to have these pie in the sky projects that you're rolling out on a budget, but at the end of the day, the real basic problems are those problems that I've identified that farmers face on a daily basis.
And we want to thank you for that. We also want to thank Dr. Ronald Ramkisoon. He was a man of his word, and I'm hearing that he's still there. So, and I remember that we said you were going to a specific time. So if these are your closing statements, we want to thank you, but asking you to weigh in, please, Dr. Ramkisoon.
Yes, DK, I would spend a little while longer with you. I think the particular topic of agriculture, I think Mr. Bharat has, in fact, outlined some of the very critical issues that have held back agriculture for quite some time, and we need to address them now. I think COVID must have pointed us to several inadequacies of the way in which we have managed this economy. One area clearly has been the area of agriculture, and in particular food security. Of course, agriculture is much more than that. And I think we need to spend much more thought in terms of what are the priorities. We can't do everything at the same time, and we have certain fundamental kinds of challenges. But I think the time is now for us to address key challenges and begin to turn around the sector so that we can make a difference going forward, taking into account what obtains not only here, but in terms of the Caribbean. I think there are possibilities for what we can do in a bigger scale if we consider the Caribbean, at least in respect of the potential for the agricultural sector, and its relationship to tourism, its relationship to manufacturing, its relationship to other sectors of the economy. I think that that kind of a vision and thinking needs to find a place in national policy, in planning, in development, in a much more significant way. And my hope is that what has happened during this pandemic is going to cause us to sit up and do the kinds of work that we have not done for many, many years, especially where we have the constraints of foreign exchange, the constraints of jobs, etc., in other areas of the economy.
And this is something that actually kind of once again puts in stark relief the question of what is an essential worker. People need to eat. People need to do these sorts of things. And also, many times after you have people on front lines, people who are working every day, and we can see them, they're visible, they are still inspired, carried on, well, they get incentive to continue by the work of musicians, players of instruments, and with that we welcome economist and entrepreneur Dr. Karen Niles. So how does this factor in, please, Dr. Niles?
Good evening, Trinidad and Tobago. Good evening, Trinidad and Tobago. Thank you so much for having me, to our colleagues. Good evening to you as well. So a couple of things that we should actually point out. So just taking a few steps back, I think what we should be paying attention to is the question of a sustainable transition, right? And so we have to pay attention to where we are right now and where we want to go. So even if you were looking at agriculture, for example, you will be moving from where we are now, which is all of the problems highlighted by Mr. Barrett, which many of which are true, to where we want to be. And the question is, where do we want to be? Because agriculture now is fully digitized. It's very advanced in terms of how it actually works. And I want to bring that into other sectors, like the creative sector, right? So I deal with policy. That's my area, right? And so if you look at where we are now in the creative sector, and if you look at this question of an essential worker, and this question of, well, people need to eat, you have a situation where certain aspects of your cost of living are going to increase. That's where we are now. We have certain vulnerable populations, certain populations that were vulnerable before the pandemic are certainly more vulnerable now. So that is a reality for many people, and that's where we are now. The question is, where do we want to go, right? And so that's what I was looking for in today's budget. In terms of the reading of the budget should not just be about a statement of facts. It should also be visionary. It should also tell you where we want to go and what are your plans are in terms of the future of the industry. So even if it was tourism, yes, there is that debate about sun, sea, and sand versus business tourism versus what Geneva was talking about earlier. In terms of persons coming to work in Trinidad, like Barbados is that. The question is, if you can, it's nice to have those policy facilities, but to what end? Like, what are you really trying to build? And that is the question. So, and even as an entrepreneur and as a university lecturer, I would ask my students, I'd ask persons who I do business with, what are we trying to achieve? That is unclear. And certainly if you're in the creative sector like I am, it's unclear in terms of what we actually trying to achieve and how we're going to get from point A to point B. I mean, I'd love to give a more in-depth answer, but I also don't want to hug the mic. I have more to say, but I made that my preliminary answer.
Thank you so much. And I like the fact that you and Mr. Barrett share that term in terms of being visionary. So looking at where you are, looking at where you want to be, and building the incremental steps to get to your destination. And I want to include you here, please, Dr. Philip Durham, and look at, because one of the things we haven't specifically gone to yet may have been education. And the question of what is an essential worker also makes me wonder what are some of those things that we should be focusing on a little more. Are we building on entrepreneurs from a younger age? Are we training individuals to be another cog in the system, another brick in the wall. How do we get people to be less risk averse and able to work towards things that are not necessarily that normal? But then again, people talk about getting back to a normal while existing in a new normal. So normal is also something that is up in flux at this point in time. But where do we start that process of education, Dr. Philip Durham?
I could start by giving credit for one of the mentions today in the budget, and that was the removal of duties on the remainder of tech items. And we have gotten accustomed to doing so much digitally. Entrepreneurs are working digitally, public servants are working digitally, the private sector, we have blended learning. And I certainly do think that is a step in the right direction to remove those duties on the remainder of items, and hopefully many people can benefit. And I did also see somewhere along the lines that persons would be trained in using technology in relation to becoming digital and so on. So that could be a good start by removing those technological barriers and making technology accessible for all. And I am not sure whether the Wi-Fi in public spaces and that kind of thing is still on the agenda, but that is certainly a good start, because if you have access to the technology, chances are you are better able to have access to the information, because there are platforms now where you are able to educate yourself, whether it's on entrepreneurship, whether it's on agribusiness, whether it's on hydroponic, everything. I've seen the Ministry of Agriculture facilitating online programs for persons interested in a wide variety of programs. So we need not look at education strictly in terms of going to the University of the West Indies. We certainly need to explore, as you mentioned, entrepreneurship and technical and STEM research and those types of fields in order to take us to the next steps that we're interested in. I also wanted, while we're on the subject of technology and how that would leverage, because we're talking about resilience in the face of a pandemic, I wanted to make mention of a very important subject that was brought up today as well: the removal of VAT and customs for equipment and aids for persons with disabilities. And I think oftentimes we don't hear much mention of what is being done for persons with disabilities. So I was really, really impressed by that, as well as I know Mr. Babwa and his colleagues will be, at least I hope they will be, in terms of the removal of VAT and duties on the electric vehicles. So we're looking at education, how we can transition and remodel education so that everyone has access. We're looking at the green agenda in terms of the removal of VAT and duties, and really, really very important policy agenda there for persons with disabilities in terms of course, that would open up more educational opportunities for them in terms of their being able to access things that they would have otherwise not be able to access, because they do depend on some of the technologies that we would be able to import duty and tax-free.
All right, and I want to ask you your thoughts on this, please, Mr. Barrett. Is it a matter that we train, you spoke about training cadres. Do we train those cadres and then build an industry that they can fit into? Do we do it at the same time? What are your thoughts on this?
So my thoughts on education, for example, again, we need to relook at how we provide education to our children in the future and how we prepare them for the new world of work. Because it's pointless teaching our children skill sets that are going to be irrelevant to the new world of work or the new world of where they live, or even being able to be global citizens. So do we continue with the old curriculums of pattern recognition, of memorization, of retention, when we know that artificial intelligence is going to take over a lot of those functions in the future? I mean, a prime example is how many of us actually calculate in our minds anymore anything? We have our phones, we type, we have a calculator. How many of us remember telephone numbers anymore? We don't, right? In the old days, if somebody asked your telephone number of somebody, or a friend of yours, you would know it offhand. Now nobody bothers to memorize these things because of artificial intelligence and because of the use of technology. The question is, how do we prepare our children for this new world of collaboration, of communication, of critical thinking, of curiosity, of entrepreneurship? How do we prepare them? Now, we can only prepare them if we ourselves understand what this new world looks like, and how and then put in place those mechanisms to determine these are the new jobs of the future, and now we're going to spend time and effort in preparing our children to be able to fill those roles and be able to earn a decent quality of life. And I don't think that is coming through for me in this budget. And I don't think that we have done, as Ronald said, we're not doing the hard work in the areas that we're sitting down as a country and planning for the next 20 years. We are a country that plans for 5 years. We plan in 5-year cycles, or even less. With a budget is 1-year cycles. But from a political standpoint, we plan in 5-year cycles. How to get back into government every 5 years is essentially our ambition. And we're not really looking at the country, what's best for the country, what are the areas we can be competitive in, how do we create growth 10, 15, 20 years down. We may not be in government, but is this the right thing to do for the country 20 years down the road? And I think that's where our mindset needs to change, and that's where we need to get the competence and the capacity from those who are in office to be able to provide that to us.
But how do we do that, Mr. Barrett, when you say we want to be teaching them differently, but my lessons plan is from 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago? How do we build competence in a system that looks at assessing and say, okay, well, you know this now, so we can send you to the other class, as opposed to saying, okay, well, these are gaps in your competence that we need to address to make sure that you're a holistic individual. How do we develop critical thinkers as opposed to individuals who can regurgitate and say, okay...
I'll just go one step further than that. How do we deal with children who may not have an aptitude for academic work, okay, but may be extremely good at technology, okay? How does our current academic educational setting deal with those children? We don't. And I'm saying, DK, that this is where we've got to sit down and say, look, listen, education is important to us, healthcare is important to us, agriculture is important to us, manufacturing is important to us. What are the resources we can put behind these? And I've made a very clear recommendation to the Roadmap Committee, and that is this. If you put those major issues of development in the current ministries, they will die. You have to identify implementation teams that are separate and apart from the day-to-day functioning of the administration of each ministry, because they are going to get sucked into the vortex of the bureaucracy and they will all die. So this is why I'm saying we've got to identify those priorities for our nation. We've got to take them out of each ministry. We've got to put them in the hands of an implementation team, and that implementation team will be measured based on its success on what we in certain markers that we put in place, as this denotes success, this denotes failure, and they are scored on that basis. There is no other way. If we put those things, the changes we want to make in agriculture, if those go and sit in the Ministry of Agriculture, next year we'll be talking about exactly the same things with nothing having happened. The Ministry of Agriculture, its budget, probably 60% of it or more, if I remember correctly, goes into administration and salaries and wages. So you have very little left for actual implementation. And I'm saying take it out of the hands of those ministries, and if you're serious, put it into the hands of an implementation team.
And I like the fact that you talk about communicating inter-government or inter-ministerial integration, because one of the best and saddest examples we have of a lack of communication and a lack of integration is one ministry fix a road, another ministry fix the pipe that is under the road, and leaves the road worse for wear.
And that's the advantage of an implementation teams, because implementation teams will be able to scale those silos and move to, because they'll be working together, because they'll have no choice but to work hand in hand to deliver the results.
And I believe that can also save us some money. Please, Dr. Ramkisoon.
Well, definitely so. But I would suggest a little tweaking of what Mr. Barrett is suggesting, in that while you want the implementation team and you want it to be separate for all kinds of reasons from the particular ministries, because you don't want that team to get bogged down by the bureaucracy, as you rightly point out. However, you don't want to create, you don't want to duplicate situations where you have people being paid in the public service and in some cases paid well to do certain kinds of jobs. I know they would disagree with that. But what you want to do is to bring the public service up to scratch in the process. So you want to create a bridge where the public service is far more productive, far more on top of the game, as it were, as that team that you are going to create to implement certain things. So you want some kind of learning to take place, and you want to create the opportunities that will ensure the various projects are running according to a schedule, that you have persons asking questions and not afraid to ask questions. Why isn't this done? When is it going to be done? There are deadlines, there are repercussions for not doing, and so on. So you want to do something new. Now, some people are saying, well, the budget has been read, and it is same old, and therefore nothing is going to take place. I want to urge policymakers, I want to urge all of us that COVID is still with us. Let us not forget that. Trinidad and Tobago today is very different to what it was in 2019 in some very important ways. And we're talking about the faster introduction of technology, digitalization, people working from home, less traffic on the road. Things are happening. In that sense, and we don't know exactly when most people will get allow vaccination, would be vaccinated, and what happens to various variants that may or may not be with us. We're not through this yet, but I think it is a time that we can rethink what we have been doing wrong, what we have been doing right, what we have not been doing neither wrong nor right over the last 50 years, and to do some of the rethinking, reorganizing, as we have said, as the recovery team said, and as the world is also doing. Remember that it is not Trinidad and Tobago alone that is going through this. When you read what is happening globally, the United States, Russia, China, whoever it is, they are going through a period here of looking at doing things differently. And therefore we have a chance to do perhaps a faster rate of catch-up if we do things right. And all is not lost, I would argue. All is not lost, and therefore let us try to organize ourselves differently, communicate differently, and definitely implement some of the good ideas that we have had along, and we have had along for years.
And while all is not lost, we are in single digits for this conversation in terms of time. And Dr. Niles, I see you chomping at the bit, so please come in.
Okay, so as an educator, some things you said I'm really passionate about. If we're going to, part of the issue is that we don't really like to dig into details, and we don't really have time to do that today, unfortunately, because as you said, we're in the single digits. But when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to the education policy, rather, you have to look at infrastructure. You have to look at the fact that we've had all of these schools empty for so long, and the displacement that has caused, even in terms of staff, right? And in terms of staff, on the staff side, you have security, you have tenure issues, you have wage negotiation issues, and then when it comes to students, you have the issues that Mr. Barrett was talking about. Issues like critical thinking skills, issues like problem-solving skills, issues like moving away from rote learning to how do you stand on your own 2 feet? How do you build an enterprise versus just getting a job? DK, you mentioned before, Are we training students to be cognizant of wheel or not? And so I guess my encouragement is this, right? We've had a budget, right? The question is, and I'm going to go back to this, what's the kind of transformation that you want to see? And I'm going to keep harping on that issue, because if you want to talk about the reality of now, I am almost certain that there are going to be students who've been left behind and will be left behind because of the fact that schools have been closed. As much as we try to get an iPad or device into every home or in front of every student, we also have to deal with the fact that getting a device in front of a student doesn't equate to education. So there will be students who are struggling with the impact of COVID and the fact that schools have been closed and there is not somebody in front of them encouraging them to do it. The second thing is that, let's not forget this other second thing. The second thing is that we have a growing migrant population, and many of the children of that population aren't able to access our education system. What does our future look like when you have children born here and children who may not have been born here who've been left behind? What are the opportunities and what are the threats? How do we take those things and make the most of it? Because now, and just to kind of build upon what Ronald was saying, you have an opportunity to build structures in place where you can actually build a bilingual economy. And you now have the opportunity to do so because of the digital transformation that's taking place, the rapid digital transformation that's taking place. So if you have facilities in place for students sitting at home, let's just remember that many of those teachers are parents that have to parent and teach at the same time. We have these equations that we need to balance. We have these things that we need to do. How do we do so and to what end? And again, in my mind, what I'm looking for when it comes to education policy is transformative policy. I'm not looking for a better way of teaching the same things, which is what I think Mr. Barrett was alluding to. I'm not looking to use an iPad to teach me how to do a quadratic equation. No, I'm thinking, okay, so this student is actually an amazing singer. They have no interest in what I'm teaching them in math, but I can show them that when they become an artist, to use a real life example, and they go in the studio, they're going to need to work out a percentage of what they're going to take home. What is the percentage? It's called a split agreement in industry terms. What is the percentage of that deal that you're going to take home? And you're also going to be able to have these skills. You need to have these skills to be able to read contracts. You understand? And so that's how I want to contextualize their education. I want to contextualize their education in terms of their ability to think and their ability to analyze problems and their ability to solve problems. I think that is going to be critical in terms of how we use this opportunity that we have now in COVID to transform this space. Because at the end of the day, the cell phones that we have are artifacts. The technology is the knowledge, and the knowledge is a slave to what we want to use it for. Let's not forget that, right? The technology is just a device. It's not a device. The technology is the knowledge that we can use to transform this space. And so when you apply knowledge to a device, then you get the artifact, which is your cell phone, your computer, your laptop. And so I have to agree with Geneva in that regard. I am happy that they have removed the duties on some of these peripheral devices, because that's going to allow us, that's going to allow some institutions to use virtual reality, augmented reality. That's going to allow for some sophistication. But certainly that sophistication is not going to be evenly spread across the entire population. What we need to figure out is how do we use the knowledge that is driving those technologies? How do we leverage that for our own transformation in Trinidad and Tobago? I think that's important.
And I see you got a stamp of approval from Mr. Barrett in terms of what it is you're saying. And you have the last minute, Dr. Philip Durham. You get the closing arguments, but we want to thank you so much, Mr. Barrett. We want to thank you so much, Dr. Niles. We want to thank you so much, Dr. Ramkisoon. Dr. Philip Durham, we thank you as well. The last minute is yours.
Thank you, DK, and thanks everyone on the panel. I would definitely like to see implementation improved, communication improved. I think these things are very important, and just to segue a bit from, I think I'd have to part company with Mr. Barrett on this one, because I don't think it's helpful just to bring in implementation teams. We need to get comfortable with building capacity, building capability in our institutions, and the best way to do that is to engage and to have an inclusive culture that does just that, builds capacity and encourages that culture of implementation and that culture of efficiency and doing things well. So I am looking forward to the transformation. I hope that we don't have too much repetition without the implementation in next year's budget. And I really wish everyone all the best in sharing the burden of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thanks again, TTT, for having this esteemed panel tonight.
And what a note to close on. I don't have any tea to drink, but definitely is a topic to be looking at implementing committees. How do we get it done? How do we carry this forward? And how do we use a golden opportunity? But we want to thank you. This has been the Budget Matters, a special version of In Depth with me, DK Rosta. On behalf of the entire TTT News team, thank you for joining us.
The winning numbers in the National Lottery